Hey everybody, and welcome back to Cash's Corner.
So Kash, what I've had on my mind the last little while is, I guess, the global state of national security. I'm thinking about, my country of origin, Poland. I've been thinking about Iran. I've been thinking about China. I've been thinking about Russia, of course, because that's kind of mostly what we're hearing about when it comes to national security threats recently. Something President Trump said in the recent interview you did with him kind of struck me. And this was that he said, basically that Iran may be just months away from having a nuclear weapon or having material to build the nuclear weapon. What do you make of all this?
So I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to remind our audience, in case they missed our interview with President Trump, you should check it out on Cash's Corner. But I do think the president's onto something, President Trump. And there's a number of reasons for that. President Trump, I know, closely followed the intelligence of all major threat streams when he was president. I know because I was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence and delivered the Presidential Daily Briefing. I know because I was Chief of Staff at DOD and all these other matters that I handled for the president. And Iran was a constant premier issue because we wanted to know what they were doing with their nuclear program, amongst so many other things. So I think the president was briefed up on those issues many, many times. And a lot of that information remains sensitive and classified. So we won't go into the details of that information. But what you said was, what you and what President Trump said is pretty informative. He says he thinks that Iran's close to a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons grade material. And based on the reporting I've seen in the media over the last year since I've been out, it looks like Iran's getting closer and closer. And the whole purpose, Jan, if you remember, the whole purpose of the JCPOA, the Iran agreement, right, under the Obama administration originally, one purpose: prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That was literally the soul of that agreement. President Trump came in and said, we're out of the JCPOA, because he felt, and I agree with him, that the JCPOA was actually allowing Iran not only to build towards a nuclear weapon, but they were violating all the agreements that they made to supposedly stop themselves from getting a nuclear weapon. And then fast forward, after all the sanctions we put on the Trump administration, which we crippled their economic regime, hurt their ability to fund their nuclear weapons program, to obtain fissile material and whatnot, the Biden administration came in last week and lifted sanctions that have been placed on Iran by the Trump administration. What does that do? That basically allows, that's the one thing that I think is very telling, and I believe President Trump was speaking to, it allows Iran's companies, people, machinery, all these programs and manning that had been sort of suspended by sanctions to go back into their nuclear arsenal. And so logically, they would be very much closer to developing nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons grade material than before. So I think that's what President Trump was referring to, and I do agree with him in that sense.
With the lifting of these sanctions, right, now China, Russia, and frankly, even European nations, some of which I think have shown some interest in working with Iran on this kind of stuff, I guess have full license to go ahead with this. Am I right in how I'm reading this?
Yes, and we're going to geek out on sanctions now. Okay, so what is the ultimate purpose of sanctions, right, vis-a-vis Iran? Under the Trump administration, it was to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, like we said. But how does that work? Sanctions basically work in a multitude of ways. You can sanction people, that is the scientists working on the nuclear program for Iran. You can sanction machinery, that is the ability for companies to trade this machinery or sell this machinery into Iran, be it from whatever country. The biggest one is the banking sanction, right? It suffocates Iran's access to the international banking system, which prohibits monetary transfers from going in and out of Iran, which is why Iran's economy is literally a cash-based economy. It's a hard currency-based economy. That's why they are currently constantly flying money literally in and out of the country, just like they did in Afghanistan, because Iran don't have, under the sanctions regime we implemented under Trump, had very limited, if any at all, access to the European banking system that they were connected to, and the SWIFT program and all that stuff. So when you lift some or all of these sanctions, you lift the machinery sanctions, the people and company sanctions to do business, and or you lift the monetary sanctions that opens them up to the banking regime, then it goes back to your point of, well, now Europe can engage with Iran on selling machinery, on sending people. But I think the bigger concern is, as you rightly said, was Russia, China. Russia and China would have, at least under the Trump administration, had to respect those sanctions because they didn't want the Trump administration to put those similar sanctions on their economic positions around the world. That is to stop China and Russia from trading or buying and selling with companies around the world. So they at least we had that mutual level of respect. They knew not to interfere over the top with the Iran sanctions. Now, when you lift those sanctions, or some of them, those sanctions, Russia and China are like, game on. What do you guys need in Iran? Do you guys need nuclear reactor material? Do you guys need people? Do you need a facility built? Do you need concrete? Do you need metal? They're just like, we'll sell it to you. What they're probably like is, knowing that Iran doesn't have that much money to begin with, they'll probably just be like, we'll loan it to you. And then basically they'll come in and say, oh, you guys can't pay us back. We'll just own a piece of whatever you build. And I think that's extraordinarily problematic, because now you have Iran relying on two of our greatest, enemies, for lack of a better word, Russia and China. They're enriching themselves by doing business with Iran. And now we have sort of a three-part attack against American interests and national security, a Russia, China, Iran sort of combination in a number of areas. So I think that's why the sanctions were so critical, and that's why I think lifting the sanctions is so disastrous.
As far as I can tell, Iran also seems to think that this lifting of sanctions just isn't enough to continue with the Iran deal. And frankly, I just don't understand how this is all working.
Part of the deal that the Biden administration was trying to cut with Iran was, we, the U.S., will lift these sanctions that you and I are talking about, but then you, Iran, sort of have to come back to the table and say, we're going to get with the program. We're going to use our Iranian nuclear program to provide energy to the civilian population in Iran, which has always been sort of their ruse, their farce that they tell the world. That's why they need nuclear material. But the second after the sanctions were lifted, you saw the Iranian government come in and say, that's not enough. If that's not enough, then why did we lift the sanctions? I mean, I know you and I are like somewhat humorously talking about it right now, but it's very problematic because we just gave up a massive stranglehold we had against deterring Iran, or from deterring Iran to build a nuclear weapon or nuclear material. And now all those sanctions pipelines are open, and Iran came back and said, thanks. So I don't know the deterrent value in lifting those sanctions, and Iran just basically told us to go fly a kite.